Melissa is Head of Department and Senior Lecturer in the Department of Geography, Environment and Population at the University of Adelaide. The main focus of her work is investigating how communities can engage in environmental decision making in this context. In this context, she has over 20 years' experience working with Indigenous peoples across Australia on community-based and co-management initiatives. More recently, she's worked on climate change adaptation initiatives related to vulnerability and community resilience, which has included work with the rock lobster fishery in Tasmania, ports and shipping, local government and Indigenous communities. Her work with the Arabana, one of the Indigenous groups in the Kata Thunder Lake Eyre region, started with research collaboration that resulted in the launch of the Arabana Climate Change Adaptation Strategy, and currently focuses on development of cultural indicators for water, which he's going to discuss with us today.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Melissa.
Thanks. Well, before I start, I wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners on whose country we're presenting today, but I'd also like to acknowledge the Arabana. I was hoping to have an Arabana co-presenter, but it just didn't work out with logistics. But obviously this work hasn't been possible without the work I've actually done with them as a team. I'd also like to acknowledge Dale, who basically brought me into this work, and the Goida program overall. And I wanted to set a bit of context. As many people have said this morning, monitoring matters. And I guess the question for me was to try and understand, how does monitoring and assessing condition work in a cultural context in the Kati Thunder Lake Eyre region? It's a bit of context here. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I think other presenters have set that context. But ultimately, I'm part of a project that's looking at trying to develop a set or a suite of indicators to assess the environmental condition of the aquatic ecosystems of the Lake Eyre region. And Dale and other presenters have looked at some of the fishy stuff. So I'm going to look more at the Aboriginal perceptions and values, which was the key aim of my project. I just wanted to sort of give you a bit of a context from the national policy scale. We're looking at the National Water Initiative and Indigenous interests. Fundamentally, there is now, I guess, a policy entry point for incorporation of Indigenous values and understandings about water in this national context. And part of how you might do that is looking at the creation of cultural indicators, which might provide some cultural understanding and context for how Indigenous peoples are looking at water in that area. And part of the benefit of doing that is that it does foster ongoing consultation with Indigenous groups across the nation. And it also provides a forum by which you can get non-Indigenous interests, I guess, and other stakeholders to try and see and understand the different ways that Indigenous peoples look at, understand and relate to water on their country. So my the aim of the project was basically to look at the development of cultural indicators for water in respect to the Arabana people, to look at ways where across the Lake Eyre Basin we might provide appropriate mechanisms for engaging with Indigenous peoples on the issue of water management, and try and gain some understanding about the values, perceptions and indicators that are used on the ground to understand water. Now, the Arabana people are one of many Indigenous groups within the Lake Eyre region, and as I said, I started working with them a couple of years ago. But you can see here the Arabana, region is right in the centre of the Kati Thunder region, and Arabana people now, as a result of colonisation and also things like the historical development of the Ghan Railway, now actually live across the nation from Darwin down to Adelaide and everywhere in between. So I try to talk to people across that area, and did that by basically doing on-country field trips, using photo voice, accessing different cultural meetings at different times, and working with the Aboriginal Committee, the Arabana Committee, and also different elders to sort of on-country introduce me to the different areas and dimensions I needed to look at. So what I'm going to do now is present some initial findings from that work, and I'm actually going back up to country next week to also make sure that when I present these findings in the final report, that it is in fact what I heard was being said. So I think that's an important part of the whole process, is actually iteratively and collaboratively working through those processes. But first of all, Arabana have a range of cultural values for water. One of the, I think, slight dilemmas of this process was that I was primarily supposed to be looking at water for river basins, but Arabana people kept talking to me about mound springs. So any sort of discussion about water is also partly a discussion about water from the mound springs as well as from the river systems. But it's also very integrally about water from man-made bores, pipes and springs. So water is a sort of a collective resource that's valued in multiple ways. It's also a resource that's perceived to be under threat in many ways. Now, I'm trying to think about whether or not I should actually construct these as what they call pressure indicators in the literature. But this is part of the discussion, is that climate change, mining, changes in water availability and condition, loss of traditional knowledge, the actual physical location of Arabana people where they live now, which is not always on and near country, and the need and aspiration for jobs and creation of livelihood opportunities on country so Arabana can go back. And these are the sorts of things, when you start talking about water, are the dimensions that start emerging. One of the other dimensions was it took me a long time, basically, even though I've worked with Aboriginal people for a long time, to work out how to talk to the Arabana about indicators. The term indicators and cultural indicators didn't really work. So eventually I worked out, when I started to talk about signs, what are the signs by which you read the country and can tell me about its health, that started to work. So I wanted to present some of those, I guess, signs. I have obviously, in a very Western scientific way, catalogued them into themes, but this is fundamentally the different areas of their country where Arabana people taking me to different water sites would say, this is what we're reading and this is what matters to us. So fauna was very important. The presence of birds, the presence of nests and eggs, the presence of reptiles of many species, but the parenti is of particular interest to the Arabana people and some species they particularly connect with. So that's one of the dimensions. I'm not going to go through species lists, but for each different water site, you might have different species and different sorts of birds and animals in those areas. The water itself, so how much water is actually present. What is the colour was very interesting. Arabana people could tell a lot about the water from the different shades of colour, which is actually hard to reproduce in the photos. I took photos of different colours, but didn't really come out, and the differentiation, you have to sort of be there. And also the variability. Now, variability in the literature, and we've talked a lot about it this morning, is an important dimension for the Arabana about the water itself and its use, and whether or not it's going to be healthy or not. How long has it been sitting there? When is the next rain? When was the last rain? And all those sorts of dimensions. We also have a series of vegetative indicators, various, particularly grasses. Arabana people pointed out lots of different types of grasses that said different things to them about the ecological condition of those particular water sites. And also climatic indicators. So there was very much a sense that there's a continuum, a temporal continuum in the understanding of values and indicators on country. So it wasn't just a case of saying this is what the site looks like now. It was a case of saying what did it look like in the past, in the present, what do we anticipate into the future with climate change and other sorts of, the potential for future rains or droughts. So the idea of variability and the idea of history is very important in the region. I've also, for the sake of convenience, categorised this idea of usability indicators. Arabana people really talked a lot about their capacity to use the site. Was the water drinkable? Was it available for camping or ceremonies? And also a lot of discussion around the historical use of the site. A lot of Arabana people have actually worked in the region in pastoral contexts or on the railways, and they have a long history over time of engagement with water, whether it's through the mound springs or the river basins or the waterholes, in relation to their historical use. And so increasingly the discussion is emerging now about the extent to which these water sites might be useful in the context of tourism, and in turn tourism offering economic opportunities for the Arabana. So usability is important. Finally, we had what I'm calling soil or ground indicators. So it's the presence of soakages and whether or not those soakages had water in them. We would often, as one of the previous speakers said, we'd go to a site, the Arabana people hadn't maybe been at that site for 5 years, sometimes up to 15 years. They had very clear images of what should be in that area and very clear memories of where the soakages were and where they should have water and whether they did or didn't have water. And there was also the existence of soil cracking. Again, it's hard to, how do you linguistically, typify that? But basically, different forms of soil cracking, different patterns of soil cracking, to me would mean nothing. It just looks like that. It's a nice picture of soil cracking, but there are different types and striations which were interpreted by the Arabana to mean particular things. And I thought that was an interesting indicator reflecting some different understanding about water and those water sites. But in the end, I guess, well, part of the question for me and part of the results that we try to write up for the Goyder Institute is to say, what does this mean for the management of water in the Kadithunda Lake Eyre region? Is it possible to achieve integration of cultural indicators into ecological typologies of how you assess condition and ecological integrity? And how do you do that? And I think there's a few things I want to share with you now. I think the language matters. I think that in many cases I felt that the Arabana people and the scientists were probably on the same page. And in terms of how they understood and assessed condition, very similar. It was more about the language and how the detail and the on-ground knowledge that it represented. I also think it's important to understand that water has multiple values. And in terms of management, if we're looking here at water management when it relates to river basins, but in fact for the Arabana they're not making a differentiation of their understanding of country and values in that way. So water is all of these values together, which has a little bit of dissonance with how it's understood in the jurisdictional frameworks of the Lake Eyre region. I think it's important to understand that those indicators operate on a continuum, past, present and future, and that history matters a lot, as well as traditional knowledge, to how Arabana understand and appreciate their country, how they visit it, how they use it, and their future aspirations for it. And I wanted to touch on the point of monitoring. Aboriginal people have basically been monitoring for millennia, and they've been doing it in many, many different ways. And it seems to me that in terms of engaging Aboriginal peoples and getting some real traction on the ground for incorporating cultural values into management, one of the best ways of doing that is to get Aboriginal peoples on their country doing that monitoring, not just from a cultural perspective, but having capacity built to do the ecological indicator work as well. And then cumulatively you'll get a very rich and local pattern of engagement in terms of what's happening, not just from the ecological condition, but the cultural condition. And I guess my last thought for the day is in that context. One of the big things that we've been asked to do in the Goyder is to work out how to integrate all of our results into something, some form and fashion. Now, we haven't actually got to this integration phase yet, and I suggest it's an area for very future interesting work. But in the Northern Territory, some of you here will know that you only have an idea of the Gama, which is the channeling and pooling, in this case of salt water with fresh water. And I like this idea because I think there's actually too much emphasis on forcing people to try and integrate knowledge systems and integrate indicators. Perhaps we could look more at looking at how the two can coexist, build bridges between them, and thus achieve an integrated outcome rather than integration in the process. Thank you.